I set a mug of coffee on the pine table in my cabin, the steam curling into the quiet air. The mug had a hairline crack running down one side, barely visible unless you turned it toward the light. I kept it anyway. Somehow the flaw made it truer than any unbroken thing. The heater rattled gently, keeping the mountain cold at bay. Outside, the pines held their stillness, as if time had stopped between snowfalls. Inside, there was only the hum of the heater, the faint ticking of the clock, and the ache of being unseen. I had bought this cabin with money saved after my divorce, a refuge that belonged only to me. Yet as I stared at that cracked mug, I wondered how something meant to keep me safe had started to feel like a stage where I had no lines to speak. When did I stop being invited to gatherings? When did I become a shadow in my own family's eyes, someone whose absence was more convenient than her presence? On the table beside the mug sat a small cake I had bought for myself. It was still untouched, the frosting smooth, as if waiting for hands that would never arrive. That was the first sign joy left unclaimed. And soon, the cabin that was supposed to hold my silence would hold something else, a noise, a trespass, a memory I could never put back. Before we step into that night, let me pause for you. Where are you watching this from? Share it in the comments below. I want to know how far these stories travel. And if you've ever held on to something cracked because it still meant home press-like. If you want to follow me deeper into this memory, hit subscribe and stay with me. What comes next is not easy to tell, but it is mine. I bought the cabin the same year the divorce papers grew their final signatures, the ink drying like a line I wouldn't cross again. It sat on a narrow ridge in the Blue Ridge foothills where winter hangs longer than it does in town, and the wind learns your name if you stay quiet enough. I didn't choose it for the postcard view or the novelty of a second home. I chose it because the road to get there, 2 lanes, switchbacks, one overlooked creek, forced everyone to slow down. Even me, especially me. The realtor had called it cozy. Realtors love that word. It forgives smallness. But the cabin's smallness wasn't a weakness. It concentrated everything I needed. The front door opened directly into a room the size of a memory I could hold with both hands, cedar walls rubbed smooth by time, a pine table with pencil grooves from the previous owner's grandchildren, a window over the sink that framed a stubborn birch tree holding its leaves longer than it should. The loft was more of a suggestion than a room, just a ladder, a railing, and a mattress tucked beneath the pitched roof, where the wood smelled sweet when the sun warmed it. I furnished the place with pieces that understood silence. A reading chair upholstered in a brown tweed that made a small hollow where my shoulder settled. A lamp salvaged from a thrift store in town, its shade slightly crooked but faithful. An old quilt my mother had pieced from dresses and aprons long before I was born. Pale blues, soft greens, prints that looked like clover, if you squinted, stitched with the patience she kept for everything except herself. In the kitchen, I stored jars of jam I made every September. Blackberry and peach, mostly lined like soft-colored lanterns. On the wall, I hung photographs from hikes. I took Alone Trail markers, a rusted gate, a sky that didn't owe anyone an explanation. I told my family about the cabin because you're supposed to tell your family about the places that heal you. Or I still believed you were. At Thanksgiving, I passed around a couple of printouts the realtor had given me, wide shots of the porch, the loft ladder leaning its narrow confidence against the wall. My sister Elaine smiled in the kind of way that makes you check your zipper. "It looks sweet," she said, stretching the word until it thinned. "How far from town?" 45 minutes, assuming the roads are clear, I said. "So a good place for a gathering," she said, as if she were inquiring about the weather. Her husband Tom nodded like that was settled. Their kids, 2 grown nephews who always called me auntie, even after they were taller than everyone, asked if there was a fire pit. I answered their questions because that's what I do. Even now, the habit lives under my tongue before I can ask what answer is owed to me. Back then, I had not reconciled with Mark, not yet. We were at the cool distance that looks polite to outsiders and hollow to the people living inside it. Years earlier, the marriage had thinned down to logistics and spare keys. If you had asked me then what love felt like, I would have pointed to the to-do list stuck to the fridge and said it feels like crossing things off alone. When we finally separated, I told myself that aloneness could make an honest home. The cabin was the proof I could point to. But emptiness is a poor listener, and on certain nights, even the trees felt like they were standing with their backs turned. The first winter after I bought the place, I learned the sound of the heater, a soft clatter before a steady hum like a train choosing to pass you by. I learned where the floor creaked and how to step around the complaint. I learned the precise angle to open the window over the sink so the coffee steam could slip out without inviting the cold in. On Sundays, I'd drive back to town with the scent of smoke stitched into my sweater and my head cleared enough to face the work week. The cabin trained me in small rituals, sweeping pine needles off the porch, stacking kindling, checking the stovepipe. None of it asked me to be impressive. All of it asked me to be present. When Mark called, it was spring edging toward summer. He asked how I'd been holding up. That phrasing, holding up, made me picture myself as a telephone pole in a storm. We met for coffee because coffee is neutral ground. He looked tired in the way men do when they've been responsible so long they forget how to be anything else. He talked about his mistakes, as if they were a project he was finally willing to manage. I didn't forgive him in that moment. But when he asked about the cabin, something in me softened, like wax near a flame. "It's mine," I said, and the word surprised me. Mine, not ours. Not yours, not theirs. "Can I see it sometime?" he asked carefully. Maybe I said, and we both let the word hang there like a porch light left on in case someone decides to come home. By fall, we had begun a small, unannounced reconciliation. Not a reunion with white flags and speeches, just a quiet returning to the same kitchen table on weeknights, the same grocery list, the same television shows watched without commentary. We didn't declare anything to anyone. I wasn't ready for my family's commentary the way they would read my choices like tea leaves. I told Elaine I was taking more time for myself. She said that sounded healthy and then asked if I could help plan her daughter's engagement party. Elaine is the kind of woman who believes generosity is a communal resource she manages. At Christmas, she insists on hosting not because she loves the work, but because she loves the authority that comes with assigning salads. She builds family events like city zones, curfews, noise ordinances, and then resents anyone who doesn't observe them. She calls my quiet moodiness if it interferes with her schedule. She calls my boundaries stubbornness if they don't serve her. When we were girls, she learned to walk into my room without knocking. She never unlearned it. Tom, her husband, is easygoing in the generic way that lets him watch lines get crossed without admitting he sees them. He likes a full house, the sound of music turned up so that conversation becomes pantomime. He believes any room can handle a few more bodies. He also believes that apologies expire overnight. Her boys grew into men who love their aunt as long as her wallet is open and her time flexible. They don't mean harm. Harm arrives anyway. It arrives when people think your patience is a thing they can spend. I kept the cabin mostly to myself that year, which made it more precious and more vulnerable. A secret you protect becomes a story anyone else would kill to tell. I told Elaine the roads could be rough in winter and the driveway needed 4-wheel drive when it iced over. That was true. I also told her there wasn't much space for gatherings. That too was true if the gathering valued care. She laughed and said, "We can make any place festive." She sends texts with extra exclamation points. It's her punctuation for permission. As the months turned, Mark started coming with me on some weekends, Soft arrivals, no promise of forever. We cooked simple meals, learned how to move around each other in a kitchen with one good cutting board. He replaced the old smoke detector without being asked. He repaired a loose step on the porch, hammering carefully so as not to split the wood. He tucked his socks into his shoes at the door, like a guest who wants to be invited back. When we left on Sundays, he checked that the windows were latched and the heater set low, and I understood that care is a language I had deprived myself of because I didn't trust the accent. Those weekends, the cabin felt like the promise I had made to myself, a place to be, where no one expected me to perform cheerfulness or forgiveness on command. And still beneath that peace, something needled. It began as a practical thought I should change the lock code at some point. Then it ripened into a suspicion too ordinary to dignify. I'd told my family the code once, for the day a delivery came when I was at work. I had never changed it. Maybe I should. Maybe I should have. The mind frames these things as errands, so you don't have to admit they are prayers. Late one Saturday, as the sky went from blue to metal, I took a slow walk around the cabin's perimeter. I checked the shed where I kept the extra firewood and the shovel. I brushed pine cones off the steps. I stood under the eaves listening to the woods breathe. No trespass then, only the anxious wisdom that says, remember, people who ignore your no don't forget your yes. I went inside and turned the cracked mug in my hand, tracing the line down its side. The flaw had widened in the wash a week earlier, when the water ran hotter than I meant. You couldn't see it unless you raised it toward the lamp, but I knew it was there, even in the dark. I tried to name the unease and got only images. My quilt folded carelessly, boots on the polished floor, music drowning out the particular hush the cabin keeps even when you're speaking. I told myself I was being dramatic. Anxiety loves a stage, and I had built a good one. Solitude memories, a cup that remembered being whole. I turned out the lamp and went upstairs. The birch tree moved a little in the wind. Somewhere distant, a car climbed a hill that wasn't mine. When I drove back to town the next morning, frost wrote its brief secrets on the windshield. I scraped them away with a loyalty card from a grocery store I no longer visited. I left the cabin in order, counters, wiped porch, swept thermostat, low door locked. On the table, I left the cracked mug where it belonged, handle turned toward the chair that fit me. By the time Thanksgiving came around again, Elaine had found a venue for the engagement party, her friend's rental house near the river. Plenty of space, she said, and we can spill onto the deck. I congratulated her on finding it, feeling the relief you feel when a storm chooses another county. We hugged, because hugging is what you do when your bodies want to talk and your mouths aren't ready. In December, when the air had that clean, hard edge, I drove up alone for a night to check the pipes. The heater woke itself, and the place came alive with its small song. I carried in groceries and set them on the counter. I opened the fridge. There, in the center of the shelf, sat the small cake I had bought for myself the week before, still uncut. I had imagined eating it with Mark, but he'd called that evening to say work had stretched late and the mountain roads weren't smart after dark. I told him it was fine. Things that matter learn to wait. I closed the fridge gently and told myself we would share it next time. Standing there, I imagined the cabin as a kind of test I would pass if I guarded it with patience and grace. I told myself that ownership doesn't guarantee belonging, and belonging doesn't guarantee respect. The door, the walls, the quilts, the photographs, these were the proof of my promise to myself, but only if I kept choosing it. Only if I remembered that a key code is not a boundary. A sentence is not a voice. A cracked mug is not a personality. I locked up the next morning and drove down the mountain with the radio off because songs felt like people asking for too much. The hills took the frost back into their shade, and the creek kept going even after I lost sight of it. In the rearview mirror, the cabin shrank into trees. It looks safe from there. It looked safe from anywhere but close. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Friday evening when I drove up the mountain later than usual. Twilight lingered in thin strips between the trees, and frost had begun to gather in the ditches. Half a mile from the cabin, I noticed a line of cars pulled into the shoulder. At first, I thought hunters were out. Then I saw balloons tied to a mailbox near the turnoff. My stomach pinched. As the gravel crunched under my tires, sound met me before sight, music, laughter, voices layered over each other like careless brushstrokes. My headlights caught the cabin's porch strung with lights I didn't own. Cigarette smoke curled into the dark. I slowed the car heartbeat louder than the engine. When I stepped out, the air was raw with beer and grilled meat. The porch sagged under the weight of people, my people. Elaine's laugh carried above the rest, her bracelets clinking as she lifted a plastic cup. The nephews clustered near the fire pit, their friends strangers to me, shoving logs into the flames. Inside, the shock sharpened. My quilts were pushed aside to make room for coats. A stereo I didn't recognize blared from the corner, plugged into my wall outlet. My pine table, the one that had held quiet mugs of coffee, now sagged beneath bowls of chips and plastic trays. Someone had opened my pantry. The jars of jam I'd stacked so carefully were spread like offerings, sticky fingerprints marking the lids. In the bathroom, muddy boots had left dark smudges across the tile. Upstairs, my bedroom door stood half open. I froze in the doorway, the hair on my arms lifting. And there on the counter lay the cracked mug. Not where I had left it. Knocked on its side, the line along its body widened just enough to catch the light. I picked it up, cradled it in both hands, and felt the silent question rise. When did I stop owning the right to my own space? Elaine spotted me near the kitchen and waved like I was a guest arriving late. "You're here!" she shouted as if the house belonged to her. "We thought you wouldn't mind. You're hardly ever here, right?" Her words slid across me like grease. My nephews glanced up, half guilty, half amused. One of their friends lounged in my reading chair, legs draped over the armrest, scrolling his phone as if he'd paid rent. "Just a little get-together," Elaine added, shrugging as if my silence was the rude part. I wanted to shout. Instead, I stared at the quilt on the couch, my mother's quilt now covered with paper plates. One corner sagged where soda had spilled. I tried to speak. My voice came out softer than I meant. "This is my place." Elaine laughed high and light as though I'd told a joke. "Family doesn't need permission. We share." Her words cracked open something old. I remembered childhood Thanksgivings when she'd slide into my seat at the table if I left for a second. When I returned, the family laughed, told me to squeeze in somewhere else. It was easier not to fight. Back then, silence seemed harmless. Tonight, silence felt like surrender. I stood there hearing their laughter pile up, wondering when I had agreed to vanish. The noise swelled. Someone turned the stereo louder. A nephew waved a beer in my direction. "Loosen up, Auntie." Upstairs, a door slammed my bedroom. My throat tightened. That room held the photographs, the journal, the one dress I had never worn again. I crossed the kitchen, but Elaine intercepted me, pressing a plate into my hands. "You need to relax. We're celebrating what I asked." "Life," she chirped, tossing her hair back. Behind her, I saw a red stain spreading on the quilt. Wine had tipped the glass, rolling onto the floor. My mother's stitches drank in the liquid silently, no protest, but permanence. Something in me fractured. My heart raced. My mind screamed, "Call the police! Demand they leave!" But my mouth refused. Years of being told I was difficult kept my voice locked. In the fridge, my birthday cake still sat untouched, its frosting unmarked. I had bought it for myself a week ago, hoping Mark might join me. Now it was surrounded by beer cans and bottles of soda, hidden as though my own joy belonged in the shadows. I gripped the counter and asked myself, why do I always swallow the words that might save me? The front door opened suddenly. Cold air rushed in, scattering cigarette smoke. Mark stepped inside, his eyes sweeping the room. He froze, jaw tightening. The laughter faltered. One by one, heads turned. What the hell is this? Mark's voice was steady, sharp enough to cut the music. Elaine blinked. It's just a gathering. We thought it would be fine. No, he said firmly. His gaze traveled the room, then landed on me. For a moment, I thought he'd demand why I hadn't stopped them. Instead, he said the words I hadn't dared. This isn't yours. This is hers. My knees nearly buckled. Relief and shame collided in my chest. For once, someone saw me not as background, not as a resource, but as the owner of this space, the woman who had built it. The room shifted. My nephews exchanged uneasy glances. A stranger shuffled out of my chair. I stood beside Mark, trembling, but steadier than before. For the first time in years, I wasn't alone in my defense. Mark stepped further in his presence, anchoring the silence. Everyone out, he said. Elaine's bracelets jingled as she crossed her arms. You're overreacting. Family should share. That's what family is for. I found my voice sharp but clear. Family is not trespass. Her mouth opened, but I didn't let her fill the air. This cabin is mine, the only place I feel safe. And you. I turned toward the room, toward the spilled wine, the strangers. The broken stillness, you've treated it like a playground. I lifted the cracked mug, setting it on the table with a dull thud. Do you see this? That's me. Cracked. Still here. But I won't let anyone split me open further. For once, silence held. Even the stereo seemed to retreat. One nephew muttered something, grabbed his jacket. Another followed. Chairs scraped doors, opened the night, reclaiming them one by one. Elaine lingered, eyes sharp. You're making a scene, she whispered. No, I said. I'm making a boundary. She left without hugging me. The door shut harder than it needed to. When the house was finally empty, the beer smell clung to the air, crumbs scattered across the table, stains blooming on the quilt. Mark picked up a cloth and began wiping the counter. He didn't ask permission. He just helped quietly, as if to prove that the cabin's heart could beat again. I sank onto the kitchen floor, cloth still in my hand, tears slipping down without asking. The smell of wine on fabric pulled me back to the divorce years when I'd watched everything I built bleed out quietly. People had taken what they wanted then, too. Time, energy, love, without asking. I had let silence sign the papers. But this time, silence was broken. I looked at Mark, his shoulders bent as he scrubbed. I can't let them back in, I whispered. You won't, he said simply. The next morning, I called Elaine. She answered with a laugh, already defensive. You're really upset about a little fun, I let her words hang, then answered. No more. You've crossed your last line. She scoffed, tried to shame me with talk of family, but I didn't argue. I simply ended the call. My hands were steady when I set the phone down. That afternoon, I carried the cracked mug to the trash. For months, I had clung to it, a symbol of endurance. But endurance without choice is just surrender. The sound of it dropping into the bin was softer than I expected. Still, it echoed. I cleaned the cabin until it smelled of pine again. I folded quilts, carefully lit a candle, opened the fridge. The untouched cake waited. This time, I cut 2 slices, one for me, one for Mark. We sat by the fire, quiet, the flames stitching light across the wood. For once, the silence belonged to me. Over the next days, I thought about what had happened. The cabin was more than wood and cedar. It was a mirror. It showed me how long I had lived without claiming my own place, how often I had mistaken endurance for dignity. I asked myself, why did it take me so long to say no? Why did I let silence become my signature? But I also felt something new relief. The cabin had been violated, yes, but it had also witnessed my stand. I had spoken. I had not been erased. Mark and I didn't discuss reconciliation in grand words. We simply lived. He fixed a loose shutter. I baked bread. We ate slowly without noise. Sometimes healing doesn't look like fireworks. It looks like a clean floor and a door locked with intention. On the pine table sat a new mug bought in town. No cracks. Steam rising, carrying the scent of coffee into air that once again felt like mine. My cabin was never just a building. It was the question I had to answer. Do I deserve space that is mine alone? That night, when my family claimed what wasn't theirs, I finally learned the answer. Boundaries are not selfish. They are survival. Family can love you and still wound you. But you have the right to draw a line even if the people crossing it share your blood. I walked away from that night not with bitterness, but with clarity. Silence is no longer my default. Have you ever mistaken your silence for agreement? Have you ever let someone use what was sacred to you because you were afraid to speak? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your story. If this memory touched you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to know they are not alone. Thank you for listening all the way through, for holding space with me. May your own boundaries be honored, and may your quiet be yours again.